We're lucky enough to have two great keynotes to speak to us today. We'll take Scott McQuire first, then Daisy Tam. Professor Scott McQuire, well, Scotty, we go back a long time, as Nikos yesterday alluded to the end of our undergraduate years, right? Scott is a professor at the University of Melbourne, with whom we have a memorandum of understanding now that we worked hard to put together, and here's a number of important books. Where to start? Visions of Modernity. I think, you know, the person who really got into the work of Siegfried Kracauer and made that alive long ago. I remember when you discovered his work, obsessed about that. Yeah, we're going to just not do big introductions, so I just refer to people to a number of books. The other interesting volume, I think, for recent work is On Large Screens. If you could have a look at that, you can find that in all good bookstores and online stores. And then afterwards we'll have Daisy Tam from Hong Kong Baptist University. She's also an older colleague of mine from now way back. Daisy, it's time passes, so welcome. I'm just going to hand the floor straight to Scotty. He knows how these things work. Scott's topic is the right to the networked city, urban communication, geomedia, and urban digital infrastructures. And we'll give the floor to you. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, John. I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm hoping that that's what I'm able to do.
You should be able to. I'm going to unpin us.
How does that work?
Looks good.
Excellent. We'll get moving then. Thank you very much for the introduction. As you say, we do have a MOU between University of Melbourne and TDTU now, and I'm really looking forward to fleshing that out in the future. This is the first, I hope, of many events. I wish I was there with you in Vietnam. I'm sitting sweating in hot Melbourne instead. I want to begin, as is customary in Australia, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I mean, this is a symbolic gesture, but it is a recognition that this land from which I speak and which I live and work has never been ceded. It's stolen land, and we have a long way to go to making reparations for that in Australia. What I want to focus on in my presentation is the impact of digital infrastructure on the contemporary city. And by digital infrastructure, I'm referring really broadly to various combinations of computing, software, networking capabilities, and digital devices that enable new ways of capturing, storing, processing, and displaying information of all kinds. Assemblages of these elements are not only changing how cities look, but how they work. And I think we can think about this transformation extending across a number of related domains. So it alters what buildings look like, it alters architecture and urban spatiality. It alters, and this is something I'll talk to today, practices of social encounter, and it alters models of service provision and urban governance. Now, at one level, we can think about digitisation as a technical change, but as various branches of social studies of science and technology have shown, technological change is never isolated. It's not separate from other domains such as political economy or culture or sociality. Last marker, I'm not suggesting that the digitisation of the city forms a single trajectory or is producing standardised urban settings across the globe. On the contrary. But what I'm doing here is taking urban digitisation as shorthand for a complex and uneven socio-technical transformation. And I think it's generating a new and ongoing tension between aspirations for urban democracy, for what Henri Lefebvre, the great French sociologist, once described as the right to the city, and new modes for exercising managerial urban power. So what I'm going to do in this paper is sketch out the terrain of this tension. And I'll begin by discussing the historical emergence of what I call geomedia, before seeking to clarify some of the opportunities and challenges that I think that digitisation of urban infrastructure is generating. Cities have long been information-rich environments. So historically, we think of communication, information in the city, often related to the intensity and the variety of face-to-face exchanges, archetypically the people who gather in the crowded marketplace and exchange stories with each other. But it also depended on the stores of material, symbolic culture that cities accumulate over time. So the architecture and monuments of the built environment, but also the various archives such as libraries and galleries. And all of this is what we might think of as the traditional media of the city. And this is what really begins to change in the 19th century. And I think the changes form a really important strand of the Industrial Revolution. So you'd think about things like the development of the steam-powered printing press that industrialized printing and enabled the mass newspaper. That's early in the 19th century. And then a few decades later, the invention of the photographic camera that initiates modern image culture. And through the same century, you see the development of various forms of communication at a distance. So electrical telegraphy, telephony, radio. All these different technological media and impacted on urban social life in various ways. I mean, the point of putting this slide up is you can see how the new media of the period back in the 1920s, creating posters, billboards, but also illuminated signage, and it starts to create this distinctive new forms of urban culture. And it creates the differentiation between the day city and the night city that we're very familiar with now. My point in citing this history is to acknowledge that mediation of urban space isn't new. It's not something that emerges with the digital. But I think awareness of the history and of the different phases in it can help us to better situate the distinctiveness of what contemporary digital media is doing to urban space now. Digital media itself is relatively old now. The first digital computers date from the 1940s. But the kinds of changes I'm talking about are the rapid expansion of computing from the 1980s, particularly the massive growth of the internet from the 1990s, and then the proliferation of internet-enabled smartphones in the 2000s. These and related developments in areas like satellites and sensor technologies underpin what I describe as a new spatialization of media in the city. So you start to have embedded and mobile media in the city. And this gives media a new role, or mediated interactions a new role in shaping the social experience of urban space. And this is what I've referred to in one of my books as geomedia. I argue geomedia is a socio-technical condition that emerges at the nexus of three trajectories relating to changes in how we interact with media: ubiquity, positionality, and real-time connectivity. I want to unfold each of those really briefly, because I think we can think about the modern media paradigm for most of the 20th century in terms of relative scarcity and fixity. And by that I mean, if you wanted to listen or watch or be connected, you had to be at a particular site. Telephone handsets were hardwired into the wall of a room. Television, at least in the West, was primarily consumed in the living room of the home, and computers were tethered to office desks. So these are the settings that have changed really decisively in the present, as media has become a pervasive element in urban life. So mobile devices, embedded urban media installations recreate the contemporary city as a space in which connectivity and access are seemingly available anywhere, anytime. And of course, there's practical limits to this anywhere, but the point I'm trying to make is that our expectations have changed. Connectivity has become our new normal, and this is driving changes in our social behaviour in all kinds of ways. The second broad trajectory, positionality, it relates to the enhanced role of location or position in the operation of contemporary digital platforms and services. And this depends on growing use of GPS technologies, which emerged following the relaxation of restrictions on civilian use by the US government, which was just over 20 years ago. And so after 2000, you start to see this upsurge in use of GPS, for instance, incorporation into mobile phones. In conjunction with rapid growth of geotagged digital data, locations become a key organising logic for digital information, particularly over the last decade. So if you think about something like internet search, the routine default filter for Google as an internet search engine is location. It's where you're searching from. The combination of geotagged data with location-aware devices means that as we move through the city, we're increasingly able to access context-specific information. And we might take this for granted now, but it is fundamental to all sorts of changes in the way we experience and negotiate urban space in the present. The third factor that I think defines the condition of geomedia is this real-time connectivity. Of course, more or less instantaneous connections isn't a new thing. You know, as I said, electrical media like telegraphy or telephony or radio or television all created their own distinctive experiences of social simultaneity. However, this tended to take particular social and spatial forms. You think of the highly centralized one-to-many communication architecture of broadcasting of radio and television, which gave us the paradigm of mass media. Real-time communication in the digital present is different because the more distributed, many-to-many communication architecture of the internet offers the potential, let's underline potential, to reshape the way that social simultaneity operates. I'm going to come back to this later, but having first established the definition of geomedia, I want to think more closely about how this starts to change digital urban infrastructure and how it makes it different from traditional urban infrastructure. We think about the study of urban infrastructure as traditionally about the design, construction, and operation of really large-scale systems. So, you know, sewers, power grids, bridges, roads. These infrastructures were certainly not neutral, but their power geometry could be derived largely from their material features, where they were built, who had access, who didn't, who profited from the construction, and so on. All these issues persist in the present. But digital urban infrastructure differs from older urban infrastructure in a key way, which is its capacity to do what Shoshana Zuboff terms informate. That's a word she's invented, but she's talking about the way that digital infrastructure is able to capture, store, and act on data as an integral part of its operation. So the way this works, I mean, you can think about something like the internet or mobile devices. The capacity to track individual actions and behaviours, such as user choices or the location of the device, is an integral part of the functioning of the system. I think one of the key things today is that this digitisation is also able to be applied to traditional infrastructure, such as roadways, through the application of network sensors or RFIDs or other kinds of communication devices. Digitisation means that all kinds of urban objects, from street furniture and billboards to cars and buildings, can be networked, and they emit growing streams of data about their use and their users. In the past, observational data about urban life was relatively expensive to harvest and especially to process, and this is no longer the case. So what we're facing now is all these different streams of digital data that are generated in a city, from social media posts to security camera footage to sensor data recording pedestrian mobility, can now be subjected to relatively cheap computational analysis. This is the context in which scholars such as Gecker and Hind have argued for recognition of a new form of surveillance, what they call infrastructural surveillance. As cities have become large-scale data generators, pressing questions have emerged about how this data is going to be used. The rapid expansion of cheap and available urban data has directly fueled the rise of smart city imaginaries, this ideology of smart cityism. Smart city concept first emerged in the early 2000s, and it built on the ideal of collecting, assembling and analysing vast quantities of data so as to enable more calculated interventions into urban operations. I'm not going to go deep into the approach now. I think it's widely been recognised to suffer from major limitations, especially in its early manifestations. Sociologist Saskia Sassen argues that early approaches to the smart city were primarily managerial in their orientation. They were way too dependent on top-down implementation via central control rooms like the famous or infamous data control center built by IBM for the city of Rio de Janeiro. Other scholars and urbanists such as Adam Greenfield have pointed to the heavy reliance of smart city programs on the uncritical application of data science terms like efficiency and optimization. And you can think about efficiency and optimization, which is, the terms most frequently used in all kinds of data and analytics. They might be appropriate for monitoring limited technical aspects of urban systems, such as network capacity or electricity use, but they offer very little purchase in understanding the city as a social or political entity. So one of the problems with smart city strategies, when they're being implemented predominantly on values like optimization and efficiency, is they don't ask really basic sociological questions like optimized for who or efficient to what end. I think the smart city concept can be seen as a response to the major historical disruption that's arising from the development and implementation of digital media technologies. It imagines a particular settlement of this disjunction or this disruption, a settlement shaped by a particular conjuncture of global capitalism. It embodies an idea or an imaginary about what a city is and how it should operate. And I think a critical response to this tendency is vital, but I don't think a response can be predicated entirely on refusal or negative critique of the smart city. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper is try and think about how you might begin to create a different urban imaginary, one that gives better expression to qualities like participation, urban democracy, forms of urban inhabitation. And this is something that Saskia Sassen paid attention to in the critique of the smart city. She said they tended to ignore the role that a city's inhabitants can and in fact need to play in any large-scale process of social change. And Sassen called for inhabitants to have better access to urban information and better avenues to communicate with city authorities. And I think these are really important issues, but I think her argument can and should be taken a step further. Urban sociability can be enhanced not just by helping inhabitants to talk back to the city, to urban authority, but by enabling inhabitants to communicate with each other, and especially to do this collectively and publicly. And as an aside, I think Lefebvre was wonderfully vague about what his concept of right to the city entailed, but it's clearly not limited to or defined by legal rights. It's more about the right of what he called appropriation. So it's about the capacity of inhabitants to use the spatial and temporal resources of the cities they inhabit. And I'm suggesting that developing new forms of public communication based on peer-to-peer or many-to-many principles has great potential to enhance the right to the city. This brings me to the concept of the communicative city, which I want to kind of juxtapose to the smart city. Communicative city is an idea I've been developing with colleagues in different fields and different countries for some years now. And I mean, the basic premise is to explore creative uses of digital technologies to enhance the collective dimension of communication in public space. So I think we have lots of communication strategies for individual communication that's centered around individuals, but much less about collective or public communication. So about a decade ago, I mean, John alluded to this with the discussion of large screens, we began conducting experiments using large screens situated in public spaces to link people in different cities. And this was really about repurposing the urban screen, making it a more genuinely public screen by taking it out of the circuit of advertising or official communication, government messaging, which is what usually dominates these installations, and instead working with artists to develop various interfaces that enabled passers-by, publics, to communicate expressively with each other. And these photographs show you images from a number of events we held, where the screen allowed collective mapping of people's place of birth, where it provided a bulletin board showcasing what people thought were the most important values of the future city, or other events we had, fairly playful dance games where people in Seoul, in Korea, and Melbourne were teaching each other to do expressive dances. I could say more about this work, but here I actually want to focus on a more recent public art installation that I think also demonstrates key concerns of the communicative city. And this is a work called The Investigators, produced by Christoph Wojcicki in Weimar in Germany in 2016. Wojcicki is one of the pioneers of urban projection art, and he's utilised site-specific projections to remotivate urban monuments since the 1980s. And The Investigators, you see a still of it here, involved a digital projection onto the imposing Goethe-Schiller monument, which was erected in Weimar in 1857. And this is a monument to the two most esteemed German writers. It's one of the most famous monuments in Germany and obviously carries significant symbolic and cultural capital. Wojcicki's project for The Investigators began, as many of his projects do, by extensive fieldwork. So he interviewed refugees, mainly from Syria and Afghanistan, about their experiences of coming to live in Germany. And these interviews were videotaped, and edited recordings were then mapped onto the statue's dimensions and contours. So what the work effectively does, it allows the refugee participants to temporarily occupy the monument with their own faces and bodily gestures. A podium was erected opposite the statue, and you can see down here on the right of the image, someone standing on the podium. And this allowed questions to be posed by audiences at the site, while live responses from the refugee participants who were situated in a nearby studio were then relayed onto the statue. What's going on in a work like this? Why not just have the refugees give their testimony in person? I think one answer is this would likely be far more confronting for them, because what they were often recounting were quite traumatic experiences. But an equally compelling answer is that Wojcicki wanted to bring the symbolic and effective resonances of the statue and the site into play. We need to remember that Schiller was himself a refugee. He was a doctor who had deserted from the army, and he had to cross several checkpoints to get to Weimar, where he was eventually protected on his arrival by Goethe. The square in which this statue is situated is a site where the Weimar Republic was formed in 1918. And it's where the National Assembly met until the fascist takeover in 1933. Wojcicki's project recollects this history, and it uses it as an opportunity for creating a unique form of contemporary public testimony. And I think this is the critical point. The work is based on engagement with other people in public space. Wojcicki's projection enables the refugee participants to speak from the statue's position of aesthetic and cultural authority. So you've got their images projected onto the statue, you've got speakers so their voices can be relayed. And Wojcicki argues that it's this process of public testimony and public witnessing that can aid in the healing of cultural trauma. And there's a quote: "It's not enough to tell the truth, it's important to make it public and to perform it, to bring emotional charge to it. Not just drop simple facts, but actually speak about your own feelings in the public space." How can we evaluate the impact of this work and other works like it? The first point I'd make is there are many such examples in which digital media has been creatively used to alter the ambience of public space. But having said this, I don't think the impact of this one work or the collective impact of all the interventions can be judged simply from the number of participants they involve, which is often a handful or a few hundred. Here I want to recall Hannah Arendt's famous definition of public space, which she describes as the space for the fundamentally political acts of appearing and speaking. I think this definition allows us to better appreciate the stakes bound up in Wojcicki's practice. It's about creating a temporary public sphere through a specific appropriation of public space. This kind of work demonstrates, or perhaps better, dramatises the new conditions of public space in which geomedia provides new capacities for communication and feedback. And at the broadest level, I think this means that urban social encounters of all kinds, from how we arrange to meet our friends and acquaintances, to how we organise collective assembly, including political protest, are becoming subject to new dynamics. I think this has become really evident over the last decade in protests from the Arab Spring a decade ago, various protests, through the various Occupy movements, including the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong in 2014, which this image is from. I'm not trying to brand these protests as Facebook or Twitter revolutions, as some commentators hastily did, as if diverse political struggles can be summarized as some kind of technology-led liberation. What I'm wanting to underline is the way in which digital media platforms have altered one of the fundamental historical constraints on organising public assembly and public communication. Rapid mobilisation of large numbers of people through control over real-time communication, or what I call social simultaneity, was once the prerogative of highly centralised organisations. So it belonged to the military or the police. They were the people who could mobilise rapidly. Network digital media has opened this kind of capacity to a much larger range of social actors. You think of an image like this, at one level it looks a little bit like a rock concert, but what people are holding is connectivity. Of course, there's an ambivalence to this because of the tracking, tracing capacities of that digital media that I referred to earlier. The corollary of this shift is a change in how public events are represented. Events like the protests in Tahrir Square or in Hong Kong were not simply reported on by media professionals. They were witnessed from the inside by numerous participants who distributed their own reports via websites, blogs, social media, online video. This doesn't change everything, of course. Mainstream media representations are still enormously powerful. What it does alert us to is the way that distributed digital networks enable the recursive modulation of events by those participating in them. And I think these new feedback systems are changing how we engage with the city as a social environment. So I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. Digitisation of the city is happening now at different speeds in different cities across the globe. How we organise and govern urban digital infrastructure is going to be a major factor in what kind of cities we find ourselves inhabiting into the future. Is this going to be a city dominated by infrastructural surveillance, one that enables pervasive data capture by both corporations and governments? This is the orientation that highlights the need to keep asking those critical questions about widespread datification of basic social practices like communication and mobility. What data is being collected? For what purpose? Who holds it? Who has access to it? How long will it be kept? These kinds of questions have been further sharpened in the context of the COVID pandemic, as many national governments have turned to digital tracking, forming new partnerships with commercial digital platforms such as Apple and Google in order to help control the spread of the virus. But as I suggested earlier, I think our other equally important task is to continue to imagine different models for organising and inhabiting public space in a network society. So our experiments with repurposing urban screens or projects like Christoph Wojciko's Investigators are very much about imagining and enacting models for temporary public spheres, ones that can facilitate social encounters between groups of strangers within public space. I think they are indicators of viable pathways for extending Lefebvre's concept of the right to the city into the new conditions of the digitally networked city. So that's where I'm finishing. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Scott. That's so much there for discussion. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions when we get to that point in the session. Yeah, thank you very much. Wonderful. people can put their questions into the chat, and that I'll take them in order when we get to question time, just so you know. I should have said that at the start. Questions for Scott or for Daisy as we get through. So Professor Daisy Tam from Hong Kong Baptist University I know her as someone who kind of accidentally, on purpose, became an ethnographer by getting a part-time job to pay her way through university. She then did years and years of field work on food in a small but prominent marketplace in South London. Apples, I remember, very important at the time, and has subsequently turned herself into a world expert on food issues and food security, speaking and TED Talks and winning awards for involvement in NGOs. We can go on, you can look her up, you can see her videos and TV, and if you're got a news connection in Hong Kong, you'll see her in the media a lot. So Daisy, I'm handing over the floor to you, Professor Daisy Tam, and her talk is called Breadline, Action Research in the Humanities, Food Waste, Rescue and Security. Daisy, please, the room is yours.
Thank you, John. Just so you know, once a market go, always a market go. So this is still very much
good
how I feel and how I see my work. But thank you very much for the invitation, and very honored to be showcased as one of the keynotes alongside such distinguished speakers. In this talk, I hope that I would be able to speak to some of the issues raised in Scott's talk, even though the kind of context is quite different. And I hope to be able to share my very small sort of way of navigating this kind of using technology to decentralize operations and enable peer-to-peer kind of interactions in my very small example of food rescue. So let me just share my screen. Are you seeing the slides?
Yep. Yes, all good.
All good? Okay, so I will just hold my notes like this. Okay. So my talk is titled Breadline, which is the name of the platform that I have developed. I situate this research as partly action research, practice-based research. I don't really know what it's called. I just understand it as part of the kind of work that that ethnography has led me to develop. And I want to position this also as an interdisciplinary research because it's something that stems from my training in cultural studies, my base in the humanities, but with a very sort of concrete outcome, which is a web application. So for the first part of the talk, I just want to quickly run through the kind of general context of food security. I know not all of us really sort of work in the area, and so I'm just going to go through very quickly those kind of sustainability discourse that you must have come across, whether it's through COP26 or any of the kind of climate events news. The second part would be more how the training in cultural studies has helped me understand and what kind of externalities I pay attention to when I work with food. And the last part would be on the application itself. So most of you would have heard of or come across some of these figures. By 2050, 2/3 of the world population will live in cities. That means the growing population against this background of rapid urbanization, together with the degradation of our environment and increased climatic events, lead to the big question of how are we going to feed the world? Now, in the methodology short sections that John ran earlier, we I think sci-fi has all the answers. Here is one where we see microwavable granules for roasted chicken. There are others, of course, perhaps slightly less palatable, but nevertheless, I think these are the imaginations of what future food would and could look like. Going back to the more kind of institutional representation, growing food is resource intensive. Its production accounts for 19 to 29% of greenhouse gas emissions and uses up 70% of global freshwater usage. Together with the kind of waste that we are producing, in general, it's 1/3 of all food that is produced get lost or wasted. So the production and the waste combined together creates this very resource intensive industry. If food wastage were a country, it would be the third largest emitting greenhouse gas emissions in the world, right? So we understand this. We also see that the SDGs that the UN has been pushing for juxtaposes this narrative and discourse of overpopulation, urbanization, and waste, and sort of foregrounds then the number of food insecure people. 9.9% of the global population are undernourished, even if we are producing enough food to feed the world. But this is not a new problem. We've always produced enough food to feed the world, yet we have always had people suffering from undernourishment. Within the context of food security, which looks at availability, access, and use, the way we understand, the way we contextualize the problem really has a bearing on what kind of solutions we come up with. The way we narrativize, the way we instrumentalize some of these frameworks generate very different outcomes. Within food security, a very stark example comes to mind, which is the Green Revolution in the 60s and 70s, where, food insecurity and hunger was understood as a problem of availability. We are not producing enough food, so let's produce more. And we calculate that lack in terms of calories. And so let's be as an energy unit, so let's sort of pump our soil full of fertilizers, and let's pump our produce full of fertilizers and pesticides so that we grow more and more intensively. Of course, the externalities of environmental pollution, soil degradation, all of that is something that we are realizing today. Hong Kong exemplifies much of this problem. The urban food system in Hong Kong depends heavily on imports. We produce nearly next to nothing of what we eat. We import, I think, over 95% of the food that we eat, in some categories, almost 100%. Yet we throw away 3,600 tons of it a day, which is equivalent to 250 double-decker buses in weight. All this whilst 20% of the population live in poverty, with very little money to sustain 3 meals a day, insufficient to sustain a healthy and active lifestyle, which is one of the definitions or one of the indexes of food security. Now, a lot of the policy framework, both in Hong Kong and globally, focus on this very linear representation of the food, of how we should and could avoid waste. First, we prevent and reduce, then we donate and we recycle, and then we transform waste to energy, and whatever's left goes into clean landfilling. Obviously, this is not as straightforward a problem as it appears. So here, that was just the general background and introduction. Here, I want to go a little bit more into how I understand what waste is, how waste is constituted and understood, and what other and what kind of externalities we can pay attention to. So within that kind of mainstream dominant discourse, we also hear this kind of rhetoric around food rescue, which is the repurposing of surplus food to donate to those who are in need. The practice of food rescue, they exist across the continents. These are organizations, often very charity modeled on charity-based models, that go organize, collect surpluses, and then donate to the poor. In Hong Kong, we have quite a few of them. In Australia, there are tons as well. It's a very well-developed industry. Not very sure about Vietnam, but this is presented often as a sort of win-win situation, right? We hear that this is a win-win situation because it cares for the needy and it cares for the environment. And, you know, I think what the critical perspective that academics both in waste scholarship or discard studies, very often take a slightly different approach, which is that the win-win situation does not ask what constitutes waste in the first place, right? And it takes an uncritical perspective and a moral high ground to say that this is the best way of dealing with surpluses. The problem with this perspective is that on the one hand, it looks as these donations as benevolent gifts. Of course, throughout very many decades of scholarship, we understand that this idea of gifting has a power relationship that is unbalanced. It is not the right way, or it is not the respectful way, I guess, to fulfill the right to food, which is enshrined in the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights. In addition, the attention to what is culturally and nutritionally adequate is often overlooked because of this idea that beggars can't be choosers. And I encounter this all the time when I am doing food rescue. You know, choice, dignity, nutritional value, even the presentation of the food can sometimes be overlooked when it is given, offered as a donation and as a gift. The second thing that this uncritical, win-win perspective overlooks is that our global industrial food system is inherently profligate. It is inherently wasteful because of overproduction. Overproduction due to market price fluctuations or fixing, the way that these kind of walk-by systems, so basically agricultural surpluses, that is just cheaper to leave to waste than to actually harvest and donate, contributes to a large extent the kind of food waste that we are producing. When we are looking at matter out of place or waste as matter out of place, very often we begin with this idea of waste as matters out of place, which recalls the British anthropologist Mary Douglas's the way she talks about dirt, and she talks about matters out of place as a way of showing that this is like focusing the attention to the classification systems that we have in place. And so she says dirt, as her example, as matters out of place, is the byproduct of a systematic ordering and classification of matter. The discard studies scholar warned against an apolitical reading of Douglas's work. And they talk about the valuation of social relations, which is inherently bound by power. The sorting of things, the sorting of recyclable matter, donatable matter, etc., is inherently the sorting of what is worth keeping and what is not worth keeping. Combining these two perspectives, we have the perspective of Suzusa, where she talks about this as a waste regime, where the regime determines what wastes are considered valuable, but also regulate their production and distribution. So when we talk about surpluses and waste as matters out of place, we have to keep these things in mind. And by paying attention to some of the externalities that has been overlooked or not cared for in that kind of linear imagination of our food system, I started paying more attention to these surpluses. Apart from looking at how waste is constituted as not just matters out of place, I was looking at the temporalities and of surplus food. By looking at the multiple ontologies of food and waste, one of the perspectives I looked at was the temporal enclosures of what constitutes waste. So food waste in particular. So the idea of food becoming waste as when it becomes inedible is not actually true. In commercial food, what constitutes edibility is not just what we understand and what is edible or not. It has to do with packaging. It has to do with best by dates, manufacturing dates, closing time of shops. All these temporal enclosures create waste, which is not necessarily conducive to its reduction. So what Moll and Blake talks about in terms of multiple ontologies of food and waste, in fact, looks at the realities of it and what kind of practices it enables, given the way we understand how waste is produced. If we pay attention to the entanglement of temporality, of its spatiality, and the politics in the making of waste, then we will come up with very different solutions. Another way of looking at waste is, another way I've looked at waste is things that are out of sync. Another dominant discourse of why waste happens is this kind of efficiency or optimization kind of discourse, right? We are not linking up the production, manufacturing, and distribution and retail processes in the right way. That's why these leakages and spillages appear. And that's why things are out of sync. So in that particular discourse, to reduce waste means to make ever better optimization processes, better infrastructures that could better link up these kind of systems. In another article that I've written called Listening to Noise, I've played around with this metaphor of noise, looking at noise as information that is not quite in sync. But from that, I draw inspiration from Michel Serres' work. And here he talks about a system that is often described as a harmony. We can imagine harmony being a system that is always in sync, right? Yet we know of no system that functions perfectly, that is to say, without losses, fights, wear and tear, errors, accidents, opacity. A system whose return is 1 for 1, where the yield is maximal, and so on and so forth. So what he's saying is that there are no perfect systems. Systems work because they don't work. There are always leakages, interruptions, spillages. But what we do with that is something that I want to show you a little bit more in my last part, which is Breadline. So drawing inspiration from the work that I have quickly mentioned, as well as paying attention to the externalities of food rescue practices, I have come up with this web application called Breadline, which is Hong Kong's first food rescue web application. It looks a little bit like this. Now, food rescue is actually a really random process, and it has been described as such. First, you have fluctuating availability. No, first is, here, sorry. First, there is the temporal and spatial challenge. So here in the urban city, and I think this is what really reminded me of Scott, or what really resonated with me in Scott's talk, is that, you know, in an urban environment is very well connected. Things are inherently very concentrated. It offers a challenge as well as an opportunity. And for food rescue, in my case, bread, this is really one of it. So there are hundreds of bakeries all spread across the city, but they all close within a 2-hour window. They all have more or less leftover bread, but we don't know where they are. So some shops obviously sell out at every given night. About 20 to 30% of the shops do sell out. So we do not know where the surplus food is until closing. So we have the temporal, the spatial, and the fluctuating ability. What current models are doing, and charities as such, they are using human organization as a response. So what they do is they recruit volunteers, they organize routes, they brief them on what they should do, and they send them out on their way. What the volunteers experience usually is that they get a list, they get the routes, they get all the information about where and when to go. They give the shop a call sometimes to know if there is bread left. If there is, then great, then they collect it. If there isn't, then too bad, that was an empty run. The organizational challenge is quite high because it's very labor intensive, and volunteer support requires a lot of support. So returning rates of volunteers are high, and for charities and NGOs, that becomes a very difficult process, which is time consuming. So basically what I've been, the participant observation, I guess, is that after running many times in this particular, in this way, I saw a much more effective solution to this problem of the spatial and temporal challenge of food rescue. So to send the volunteers in the right place at the right time, we created not interactive, but we created a map view of where all the bakeries are. Volunteers are able to select their runs independently. So compared to a centralized operational model where there are assigned routes, they can choose their own routes. And they can delete and add runs right up to the last minute. In addition, we also provide real-time information of how much bread is left in all the bakeries. So where you see the pins change color, that's where all the live information comes in. Now, the important what I was thinking here was that, you know, we wanted a decentralized system where volunteers are empowered to do and act on real-time information. So the information has to be made shareable via internet and smartphones, and actionable. So if they can see where the bread is, they need to also claim it so that nobody else goes. If they see there is no bread, they can quickly check on the map view to see where there are where the bread is available. And like this, they can be at the right place at the right time. This is what in some the kind of language and discourse changes as I go through the slides, because that's also how sometimes it's important to also engage in that kind of layman terms where, you know, agility in being able to respond or communicate. I think it's important. And I think this is also what I try to do, referring to Scott's talk about using technology for communication, for action, that is decentralized and that is not held in one place where it is assigned. So in a very small way, I hope that Breadline is also this act of trying to create networked intelligent actions, which I see in opposition to artificial intelligence. And this is important because I had many discussions about, you know, what we should automate and what we should not automate with my programmers. For example, the programmers were quite keen on doing route optimization. And I refused that because I said we needed to allow for participants to be able, or participants and volunteers and movers of the city to be able to leverage on their own, first, their own mobility, you know, if they're coming from work or going somewhere else. Number two, their knowledge of the city, where the shortcuts are, how they navigate through the traffic and the time. These are things that I don't think should be automated, but rather be opened for the individual to participate and leverage on that. So all of this combined together provides this kind of just-in-time food rescue where, you know, we collect the leftover bread using real-time information and mobilizing a crowd in a way that is decentralized. The results are nevertheless very encouraging. We've been operating since April the 1st, 2020, so a year and a half. We only run on Fridays. We've collected almost 87,000 loaves of bread. We have improved, I mean, here I adopt the language of efficacy and optimization, but we have improved volunteer efficacy 109% compared to a centralized model. Our returning rates are very high. Our top runner has collected 6,000 loaves. And the fact that we are able to cover all the shops with overnight, all the shops that have reported surpluses, we are almost able to 98% of the time cover that and collect that. So our hit rate is extremely high. And this translates into this kind of dominant discourse of greenhouse gas emissions as well. You know, if we were to throw this waste into landfill, then we would have wasted the current scenario, which is on the left-hand column. What we have done instead, because we rescued the bread and because we actually used it as food, we avoided 77 tons of carbon emissions. We saved 470,000 gallons of water. We have recovered, I would say, more than 39,000 meals, but here is just one of these kind of impact calculators that you can just punch in the numbers and generate the results from. With the team of people, and these are the kind of talents that I've been working with: program designers, UX designers, business developers, geographers, and all of this would not have been possible without the different perspectives. So again, highlighting the importance of interdisciplinary research and action. This is Hong Kong Food Works. This is my website, and we can talk more about the other things later on. Thank you, and I hope I've kept to time.
You have, Daisy, you've got like 90 seconds left, so you know that's about equivalent to your 98% optimism optional collection hit. Well done. Great presentation and very interesting, and yeah, well, there'll be questions, I'm sure, as there are for Scott. And what we're going to do is of course take them both in order of what's in the Zoom. Let me work out how to also spotlight Scott. And if you could unmute Scott, you'll be able to answer some questions, which I'll ask people to ask as well. So first of all, it's Olivia Guntarak, who you'll know from Melbourne. Olivia, are you here? She may not be. This is the problem. She seems to be stepped out. So let me ask her a question anyway. Thanks for the rich presentation, Scott. You touched on impact. How might we understand this new dynamic of creative performativity in terms of social change, especially long term?
I mean, that's a great question. I think one of the issues when you're talking about, say, artistic interventions into urban space, they're often dismissed as superficial or inadequate or temporary. I guess one of the reasons I was saying I don't think you can evaluate these kinds of interventions simply in terms of the numbers of people involved, that they have a different role in terms of whether you think of them as a form of action research or as creating experimental models of the public sphere. The long-term effects, I mean, I guess part of this is how do we think about social change? Is there going to be a big event or is there going to be lots of little ones? And I'm probably more on the side of the actual lots of little ones for social change. This is about the creation of public culture. And when I think about public space in the modern city, I'm talking, say, from the mid-19th century as industrial capitalism takes off, one of the primary roles that public space plays was as the contact zone for strangers from diverse backgrounds, because this is the real big change that happens in the city. Sociologists like Zimmer pay attention to this at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a different social environment. You don't know most of the people around you. They're from different backgrounds, migrants from the country, as Daisy talked about, or they're often migrants from other countries. So you have this challenge of how you form social bonds, social relationships to people with whom you don't necessarily share cultural background, religion, language, etc. And this is even more intense, I think, in contemporary cities where migration has become much more jagged. There's temporary forms of inhabitation and so on. And I'm reminded of, the great urbanist Richard Sennett, who talks about the way in which contemporary cities are defined by the need for a very different form of social cooperation. Cooperation between people, he puts it, they don't necessarily know each other or like each other or share the same values, but they've got to work out how to live together. And for me, this is the role that public space has played. Yes, of course, it can be a side of violence, but it's also a place in which people have everyday experiences of engaging with other people. And I guess one concern in the 21st century is it going to continue to play that role? Because we have cities that are striated in all kinds of new ways, whether that's gated communities or whether that's economic segregation due to property prices, or whether it's forms of digital filtering, that you only connect to the people that you already know, etc. Sennett said a really interesting thing about our relations to strangers. He said, this isn't an ethical issue. It's not something about we ought to do this. He said it's actually an issue about skill. It's about having the capacity to relate to others, to form those kinds of public relationships, that kind of interaction with strangers in public. He said it's a skill. It's something we can learn. It's something we need to nurture and facilitate. And so this is where I would situate those kinds of small-scale artistic interventions, that they're often promoting, the ones we're interested in at least, that interaction between strangers, that kind of development of that skill of awkwardness and uncomfortableness and so on that might come, but actually brings enormous other kinds of benefits with it. So that would be one kind of answer to give to that question.
Cool. Next one is Fiza. Fiza, are you here?
I'm here.
Okay.
It's a very interesting presentation, Scott. You briefly mentioned about violence during your comment, like just right now, but can you talk a bit more about the darker side of network connectivity and instant connection with respect to citizen or different actors mobilizing in violent ways in public space? So, for example, in recent cases of lynchings in India, mob organized themselves through the technology of WhatsApp, or during the Arab Spring, government used social media to find activists and persecute them. So we still carry the real danger of like these kind of things happening, like with the positive side of the technology. So maybe can you just speak a bit more about that?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I mean, look, this is very much what I talk about as the ambivalence of the digital. And it's actually, because you're talking about a communication architect, it's very hard to disentangle what we think of as desirable uses or good uses. I mean, this is the way people often divide things. I want the good use, but I don't want the bad use. but it's like when we're looking at, say, the development of books. You know, we have enormous changes that go on, but we can't actually separate out and say, well, yeah, we wish, you know, certain books had never been written and just keep the ones that we would like to have. I think that the issue around tracking and tracing, you know, I gave some attention to, because I think this is really problematic. I would also say that there's a much longer history there, of course, because, you know, you think back to something like the Paris Commune, and the communards stood up on the barricades in 1871 and had photographs taken because they were, you know, celebrating what they'd achieved. And then the government used those images to track them down later, and people were incarcerated on the basis of being recognised through their photographs. So there is a longer history. I think one of the issues in the present is the scale and speed at which that kind of tracking and tracing can take place. And the final image I showed in my talk was a surveillance camera in Moscow, which has a lot of surveillance cameras in it right now, and it's been allied with facial recognition technology. And this is happening in a lot of countries around the world now, and I think it's a very worrying development. It's being auspiced under the need to track down, you know, COVID positive people, et cetera, but I know in Russia they've used it to police political activism, for instance. So I think this is, you know, one of the huge problems we're facing when you talk about governments shutting down the internet. I mean, this shows you again some of the, you know, the internet was created as a distributed communication architecture. It came out of defense research in the US, you know, in response to how will communication networks survive nuclear war. That was the sort of impetus for it. But it's not a completely decentralized architecture, and national governments have the capacity to have, you know, major impacts on it, which in the 1990s people didn't take as seriously. They, you know, everybody thought the Great Firewall in China would fail. Well, it didn't. You know, during the Arab Spring, Egyptian government shut down the entire internet for 6 days to control the demonstrations. So there is centralized aspects to it, and I think that the platformization of the internet that we've seen, where you have really powerful actors who are corporations who are achieving monopoly status in certain areas. You think of, you know, Facebook or Google, or differently eBay or Amazon. This is, you know, Habermas years ago talked about the refeudalization of the public sphere, you know, the way in which the public sphere in the 20th century under broadcasting conditions started to be refeudalized. I think that's very much what we're seeing with the internet. We're seeing a kind of feudalization or refeudalization of that, which is why we need to be really concerned about all of those issues to do with data capture and to do with the kinds of business models that have evolved around, you know, what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. I think it's grown up so rapidly that we haven't responded to it, and it's going to be hard to unwind, but that's a really critical thing to be doing, to be thinking more about the common spaces that those kinds of digital networks enabled and how they would be auspiced under different kinds of platform structures.
Super, Scott. Yeah. The next question is from Huai. It's just across the room from me, so we're actually in real-time space, but please. You want me to ask the question? Okay, so here says, for Professor Scott, how does the government handle misbehavior on social media? Can you give an example of a violation of the social network law in your country?
Oh, look, I'd say in Australia, the government handles it fairly badly. I mean, one thing that they've done is intensify the surveillance because they mandate data retention. I think in Australia, data is now retained by the internet service providers for around 2 years, so that, you know, this is in the name of tracking down terrorism. But there's always a creeping a functional creep with these systems, you know, that you need to be concerned about. The Australian government's also considering augmenting defamation laws as a way of dealing with what they call digital trolls. This would be a really inadequate response to hate speech, for instance. You know, they're not dealing with the issue as it actually plays out for most people. But defamation laws in Australia are very oriented towards the already rich and powerful, and would give them more resources to shut down speech. So I think we need to, you know, be thinking about issues like much more robust digital literacy, educating people how to respond in these spaces, creating different kinds of cultures, because I don't think you're going to ever be able to get rid of, say, hate speech, but you can certainly be more robust in addressing the kinds of manipulations that are taking place in the present, where you see very deliberately organised groups targeting particular issues and blowing them up in certain ways, and, you know, trying to sway public opinion that way. But I don't think the Australian government is dealing with that particularly well at all. It's got very little interest in protecting the privacy of individuals. It doesn't seem to have any interest in contributing to the vitality of other forms of the, you know, public media that might enable the internet sphere, which depends on other forms of media, to be more healthy, if we can put it like that.
Thanks, Scott. We might think about this very comparatively. Obviously, when you ask that question, it's nearly always comparative. And you know, thinking about Vietnam, you mentioned Rand Corporation as being, you know, and with their history of the internet, they're also very famous for in Vietnam for being a part of basically interrogation and security information for the US forces here. They ran the kind of so-called ethnographic interviews of prisoners and so on. They had a big role in this country. But I think the comparative thing that we should not pass by mentioning is another Australian, actually, which is Julian Assange. I always wonder what your take is on him in terms of the bigger screen.
Yeah, look, Assange was once a student at the University of Melbourne back in the day, and then a student at RMIT down the road. He's someone who has been abandoned by the Australian government for years now. And this is not, for me, an issue of, you know, whether Assange is a good or a bad character. I'm not going to make judgments about that. I don't know him personally. But in terms of the role played by WikiLeaks in making available certain information around US military operations, it's unprecedented to prosecute someone and pursue them in the way he's been pursued. Other media organisations that publish that material are not being pursued in the same way. Assange actually won a Walkley Award, which is a journalism award in Australia, for the WikiLeaks material. And yet the Australian government is standing by while he is potentially going to be extradited to the US and spend the rest of his life in prison. So I think, again, that's demonstrating some of these really complicated and nasty issues about borders, about where offences are committed, and about the new kind of territorial acting that large actors like the US give themselves in a digitally networked environment, where they say, okay, you've leaked our secrets, we're going to prosecute you wherever you exist.
Thank you. I just thought we should not go past, since we started off with recognising the land owners, we should also recognise British American imperialism. For Daisy, it's Lau Kam Tu has asked a question. Do you want to ask that question yourself? Kam Tu? So I will ask that as well. Thanks for the great presentation, Daisy Tam, for you, what environmental and social problems can arise when food excess and food shortage go hand in hand?
Revolution. No, I mean it's only a semi joke. I guess like on an immediate level, food shortages have always led to the destabilization of politics, right? I mean, revolutions have started because of hunger. And that's why food security is called security, is a soft form of security for governments. I think that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that, you know, beyond the kind of obvious environmental degradation of greenhouse gas emissions due to rotting food, etc., pollution of water, land, and soil. I think, beyond that, those kind of impacts, I think what we're looking at really is the question of, you know, are we looking at this as a problem or a symptom of an issue, which is that we are relying on a global industrial food system that is inherently wasteful, and that it has to be maintained in such a way because of value, because of economic value. You know, the built-in obsolescence is in every part of that production, not only in e-waste and all this, but also in food. And so, you know, how do we begin addressing that is really the much larger question that is at stake. I prefaced the whole, I talked about all this, and I prefaced the wider issues before food rescue, because I also wanted to point out that food rescue is not the answer to food waste. It does not address the inherent wastefulness of this system, and it does not address the equitability of or the social injustices that lead to some people who have a lot and some people who don't.
And then, that's my one. Well, forget that. I'll ask part of that question. I did want to mention that you mentioned Soylent Green, and I just do want to note that that was set in 2022. Right, that's next year. Next year, we're going to have to, you know, because the pandemic will continue, we'll be eating each other. As this is sci-fi film about so many films lately, and TV series, especially the 100 and so on, have involved cannibalism. Basically, that's how we survive the crisis, by eating each other. I'm a bit worried about that. But you started off with sci-fi, and then you ended up making an app. I'm more interested in actually the debates that you had while making the app, because that seems to be a really relevant, like, negotiation or struggle. Is there any more you can say about that process? Any story about, I mean, the one you told about the dispute over tracking local knowledges, I suppose, was pretty key.
I think that's why this process was, I think, very interesting. It's very limited in the sense that, you know, when I use this as an example to talk about, you know, decentralizing operations and allowing actionable information to be shared amongst the volunteers, I mean, the kind of communication I'm talking about is very minimal. It's very minimal, and it's not meaningful in that kind of cultural or humanities sense. But it is an attempt to create a different way of doing things. And I think the debates that I have with my programmers and even funders, who are often driving us, the humanities, arts and humanities, into something more quantifiable, therefore more valued, algorithms, modeling, prediction, all of these that are held up in value, again, using the same kind of, like, you know, valuation systems. All the things that we do not value are or no longer, or lesser valued, is human mobility, understanding intelligence of the city, embodied knowledge, like all of these things that are not held, not perhaps valued on paper, is something that actually makes the app work. There are tons of apps out there, and there are so many startups that fail with apps. And why is that, right? It's because of every piece of technology is social, it's socio-technical. You have to understand the limitations. You have to understand the bottlenecks of how people interact with technology and what technology represents to the people. And if you use a user-centered approach in the design system, what kind of alternative solutions will you get? And I think this is partly why I feel that this is, even in its very small form, radically different kind of response to some of the tech-driven approaches and tech-driven design apps that has ultimately failed. Because I think having a human-centered approach, and not only in the investigation but in the design process, is something that technologists don't do. Right? They don't look into the ethnography. They don't do the groundwork. They don't understand the users and the bottlenecks. And so a lot of the debates kind of very often is between a human-centered approach and a technologist sort of approach. What you want to automate, what technology can do, is not necessarily what it should do. But there is still value, and I think that's why I think that's why this is an interesting sort of ongoing process where I observe how people use it, what are the kind of feedback that they get, that they give, how does technology enable them to make better decisions, I think is what I try to do in this very small way. Right. So how to empower them to be able to act themselves independently.
Great. We have to stop it. I wanted to continue, but we are out of time and we've got other sessions to go to. But look, both of you ended up using the same positive words in a way. So there's so many resonances. Thank you so much for both talks. Scott, Daisy, wonderful to have you here, and I hope we see you in the other sessions. Thank you. Yeah. And for everyone else, we at past we move to the 3 panels. So you move out of this session into the next from the lobby, I suppose it is. Thank you all for joining, so many of you. And now we distribute into 3 sessions. There are 3 more sets of panels to go, so we're kicking off the afternoon really well.